I used to believe I had it all. A loving wife, Emily, a son, Jason, who had grown into a smart and capable young man, and a comfortable life that seemed like the perfect example of a happy family. Our home was always full of life, laughter, and the kind of calm predictability you come to appreciate after years of marriage. We lived in a suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Jason was my pride, and Emily, well, she was everything to me, or at least I thought she was. Jason had recently started university, and with it came new friendships. One friendship, in particular, stood out: Ethan. He quickly became Jason's best friend, and before long, it felt like Ethan was practically part of our family. They went to parties together, shared vacations during the summer, and more often than not, Jason would invite Ethan to our home. I didn't mind. He was a respectful, good-looking kid with a solid future ahead of him. They spent hours talking about their plans for life. Ethan wanted to work in marketing, and Jason was following his path in engineering. At first, everything seemed completely innocent. We'd all have dinners together, watch movies, or even play golf as a group. I enjoyed Ethan's company, even jokingly calling him my second son. I had no reason to be suspicious of anything, no reason to think that my life was anything but perfect. But Emily, she had a tendency to notice things, especially when it came to younger men. She'd point out how well-groomed Ethan was, or how he carried himself with the confidence of someone beyond his years. It wasn't just him, though. Emily had a habit of commenting on younger men in general. She'd often mention how some of them drove nice cars or took expensive vacations. She even admired young bloggers, even if their audience wasn't large, because of the lifestyle they portrayed. I brushed it off as harmless after all. Who doesn't notice attractive people? However, as time went on, I noticed her compliments about Ethan came a little too frequently. When we all sat around the dinner table, I couldn't help but see how her eyes would linger on him a little too long. She'd laugh at his jokes, sometimes harder than necessary, and I would see her casually patting him on the back or shoulder, often when it wasn't really called for. There was a closeness developing between them, something that felt off but that I kept ignoring, not wanting to believe my gut. Even Jason had picked up on it. I remember one night after dinner when we were cleaning up, he made a passing comment. "Mom's really friendly with Ethan, huh?" He laughed, but there was a hint of discomfort in his voice. I had shrugged it off. "She's just being nice," I told him, trying to convince myself more than him. I didn't want to admit that something wasn't right. After all, Emily and I had been married for over 15 years. She wouldn't cross that line, right? Ethan had become such a regular fixture in our lives that it wasn't strange for Emily to have his phone number. Whenever Jason came home late or if they went out somewhere, Emily would occasionally text or call Ethan to check if everything was okay. That's what she told me, at least. It all made sense. Or at least it did until I started seeing the signs I had been too blind to notice earlier. I remember the first time the doubt crept in. We were all sitting in the living room watching a movie. Emily was on the couch next to Ethan, and I was in my usual spot. At one point, I saw her casually pat Ethan on the back, leaving her hand there for just a bit too long. It was subtle, almost innocent, but not quite. I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in years: jealousy. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just a friendly gesture, and that I had no reason to doubt Emily's loyalty. But as much as I tried to shake it off, the feeling gnawed at me. Every little glance, every small touch started to stand out, and the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. Emily had always been a social butterfly, someone who liked to make others feel comfortable, but this was different. There was an energy between her and Ethan that I couldn't quite explain. They'd have conversations that felt more private than they should have been, even when I was sitting right there. At dinners, she'd make little jokes aimed at Ethan, and he'd respond in kind, with a smile that lingered a little too long. I should have said something then. I should have trusted my instincts. But instead, I swallowed my doubts and told myself it was all in my head. After all, this was Emily, my wife. We'd been through so much together. We built a life, a family. She wouldn't throw it all away for a fling with a younger guy. She wouldn't betray me like that. But deep down, I knew something was changing. The small, seemingly innocent moments were adding up, painting a picture I didn't want to see. My perfect life, the one I had worked so hard to build, wasn't so perfect after all. I started to withdraw, distancing myself emotionally. I didn't even realize it at first, but the tension was starting to eat away at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was slipping away, that what I thought was harmless admiration was something much more dangerous. Ethan continued to come around, and every time I saw the two of them together, my chest tightened a little more. Jason didn't seem to notice anymore, probably because I had reassured him so many times that it was nothing. But I knew. I could feel it in my bones. Something was happening right in front of me, and I wasn't sure how to stop it. The worst part was, I didn't want to know the truth. I wasn't ready to confront the possibility that my wife, the woman I had loved for so long, was capable of betraying me. So, I did what so many others do in these situations. I pretended everything was fine. I told myself the story. I wanted to believe that Emily and Ethan were just close because of Jason, that there was nothing more to it. But the cracks were already forming, and deep down, I knew they would only grow wider. All it would take was one more moment, one more clue, to shatter the illusion I had been holding on to. And when that moment came, it would be impossible to put the pieces back together. The small, nagging doubts I had tried to suppress started growing into something larger, something that I could no longer ignore. Emily's behavior toward Ethan became more noticeable with each passing day, and while I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the suspicion was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. It was subtle at first, small things that didn't seem to matter. But when you notice one strange thing, you start to notice them all. Like how Emily always seemed to ask when Ethan was coming over, or how she made sure to be home whenever he was. It wasn't something she did for any of Jason's other friends. And then there were the dinners. I'll never forget one particular evening. We had all gathered around the table for what should have been a typical family dinner. Jason had invited Ethan over, as usual, and we were sitting there, talking about Jason's classes, Ethan's plans, and the general small talk that made up our meals. But Emily's attention was entirely focused on Ethan. She smiled at him more than anyone else at the table, laughed at his jokes a little too eagerly, and when she touched his arm to compliment him on something, it wasn't the friendly pat I had tried to convince myself it was. Jason, sitting across from me, caught my eye. His expression mirrored mine: confusion, discomfort. We exchanged a silent look, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. What was going on with Mom? I pushed the thought aside, trying to focus on the conversation, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. The way Emily looked at Ethan was different. She wasn't just being friendly. There was something in her eyes, something I didn't want to name. As we cleared the dishes, Jason pulled me aside. "Dad," he said quietly, "Mom's acting weird, isn't she?" His voice was hesitant, as if he didn't really want to know the answer. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone casual. "She's just being nice, Jason. Don't worry about it." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. I could tell Jason didn't either. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Emily slept soundly next to me, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside my head. I wanted to believe that it was all in my mind, that I was overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The laughter, the lingering touches, the way her eyes lit up whenever Ethan was around, it wasn't normal. It wasn't right. Then there was the phone. Emily and Ethan had exchanged numbers long ago because there were times when Jason would come home late, and she needed to check in with Ethan to make sure everything was okay. That made sense, and I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. But now, I started to notice how often she was texting him. It was no longer just to check on Jason. I'd see her smiling at her phone, typing quickly, and when I asked her who she was talking to, she'd always say it was one of her work friends. But I wasn't so sure anymore. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. Jason was out with friends, and Emily was home alone. I had been out running errands and came home earlier than expected. As I walked in, I heard her talking on the phone. Her voice was low, almost hushed, and there was a tone of excitement I hadn't heard in a long time. I couldn't make out everything she was saying, but I caught enough to know that it wasn't work-related. "I can't wait to see you again," she said, her voice carrying a sweetness that turned my stomach. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, frozen in the hallway, listening to the woman I thought I knew so well. Last time was amazing. I think about it all the time. I didn't confront her, not yet. I wasn't ready to face the truth. Instead, I went for a drive, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Last time? Amazing? What had I missed? How had I not seen this coming? I parked by the side of the road and stared at the steering wheel, the weight of everything crashing down on me. Emily was seeing someone. I had no proof yet, but deep down, I knew. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was going on, and it wasn't innocent. In the days that followed, I started paying closer attention. I didn't confront her directly. I needed more than just a hunch. So, I watched. I noticed how she would get dressed up a little more on the days Ethan was coming over. She'd spend extra time doing her hair, putting on a bit more makeup than usual. And she'd smile, God. The way she'd smile when she saw him walk through the door. It was the kind of smile that used to be reserved for me, back when we were young and in love. I also started checking her phone when she wasn't around. I knew it was a violation of her privacy, but at this point, I didn't care. I had to know. But every time I checked, I found nothing. She was careful, too careful. No messages from Ethan, no calls logged between them. But I knew they were communicating. I had seen it with my own eyes. Then there was the social media activity. I wasn't one to pay much attention to likes and comments, but I couldn't ignore the fact that Ethan was always the first to like Emily's posts, always leaving comments that were a little too flattering for my taste. And she'd respond, sometimes with hearts or winking emojis. It made my skin crawl. The suspicion that had once been a small seed had now grown into a full-blown certainty. Something was happening between them, and it wasn't just in my head anymore. But I still needed more. I needed undeniable proof before I confronted her, before I could admit to myself that the life I thought I had was falling apart. One evening, after Ethan had left and Jason had gone to bed, I sat down with Emily. We were watching TV, but I wasn't paying attention to the screen. My mind was racing, and I was barely aware of the show playing in the background. Hey, do you think Ethan's coming over this weekend? Emily asked casually, not taking her eyes off the TV. I shrugged, my voice tight. I don't know. Why? No reason, she said quickly, a little too quickly. Just wondering. I glanced at her, trying to read her expression. She was focused on the show, but there was something in her voice that made my chest tighten. I couldn't take it anymore. The suspicion had consumed me, and I was tired of pretending everything was fine. I needed to know the truth. The more I watched, the clearer it became that Emily wasn't just flirting with the idea of something dangerous. She was already in it. I had convinced myself I needed proof before confronting her, but in my heart, I already knew. The lies began to pile up, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me every day. It started with the business trips. Emily worked in sales, and every few months, she would have to travel to meet with clients. It was something I had gotten used to over the years, and I trusted her completely. But this time, something felt different. One night, after Jason had gone out with friends, Emily told me she had to leave the next morning for an out-of-town trip to meet a new client. It's important, she said, packing her bags with an energy that felt off. We've got this potential big deal in another state, and I'll be gone for a few days. I didn't question it at first. After all, she had been in sales for years, and these kinds of trips weren't unusual. But as she packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was almost excited. It wasn't the usual stress or rush of work travel. There was a lightness to her that made my stomach twist. I asked her some casual questions about the client, but her answers were vague and evasive. The next morning, she kissed me goodbye, said she'd call when she got to the hotel, and left with a bright smile. I watched her drive away, the sinking feeling in my gut growing stronger. Something wasn't right. 2 days passed, and Emily sent her usual check-in texts. How the meetings were going well, how the client was excited about the product, and how she'd be back by the weekend. But something gnawed at me. The messages seemed scripted, almost too perfect. Then, on the night she was supposed to return, she sent a message saying, "The client wants to extend the meeting by one more day. I'll be home late tomorrow instead." That was when I knew. Emily was lying. This business trip wasn't about work at all. While she was gone, I found myself growing restless. I couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything other than the gnawing thought in my head. Who was she with? I paced around the house, trying to push the thoughts aside, but I couldn't. Every time I imagined Emily away in some hotel room, I didn't see her with a client. I saw her with Ethan. I needed answers. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I checked her location through the GPS tracker in her phone. We had set it up years ago when Jason was younger, in case either of us needed to find each other. I had forgotten all about it until now. With shaky hands, I pulled up the app and checked where she was. My heart sank. She wasn't in the city where she said she'd be. She wasn't even in the same state. The location showed she was at some beach resort a far cry from the client meeting she had described. I felt sick. I knew then that she wasn't on a business trip at all. She was with him. With Ethan. My mind raced, piecing together every subtle glance, every touch, every suspicious phone call and text. It all made sense now. They had been seeing each other for who knows how long, and I had been blind to it. The next day, Emily came home, acting as if everything was normal. She walked through the door with the same satisfied smile, telling me how the client loved the presentation and how the deal was moving forward. She was radiant, more relaxed than I had seen her in a long time. I tried to act like nothing was wrong, but inside, I was a storm of anger and betrayal. How could she lie to my face like that? How could she stand there, telling me about some fake business trip, when I knew the truth? I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I held back. I needed more than just a location on a map. I needed undeniable proof. The next few weeks passed in a blur of suspicion and quiet rage. Emily continued with her charade, going to meetings after work, attending work dinners that ran late into the night. Every time she left the house, I felt the bile rise in my throat, knowing that she was sneaking off to see Ethan. One night, I noticed a strange pattern. Whenever Emily had one of these so-called work dinners, Ethan would suddenly disappear too. Jason would ask if Ethan was coming over to hang out, and Ethan would always have some excuse. He was busy, he had plans, he wasn't feeling well. It was too convenient to be a coincidence. They were meeting in secret. I was sure of it. Then came the messages. Late one night, after Emily had gone to bed, I saw her phone light up with a text. It was from Ethan. My pulse quickened, but I didn't reach for the phone right away. I waited, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, making sure she was asleep. I picked up the phone and opened the message. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled through the conversation. The texts were subtle, nothing too explicit, but they were enough. There was no doubt in my mind anymore. This wasn't the kind of conversation you have with your son's friend. There was a closeness that had no place between them. Emily had deleted most of the messages, but she hadn't been careful enough. One thread remained, and it was enough to confirm my worst fear. They were planning to meet again, at a hotel this time. They had been careful, but not careful enough. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I had ever experienced. My hands trembled as I put the phone back on the nightstand, my mind racing. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the boldness of it, the sheer audacity of them carrying on right under my nose. That weekend, Jason and I had plans to go golfing out of town, and I knew what would happen the moment we left. I had seen the messages, I knew their plans. Emily thought she was so clever, but this time, I would be one step ahead. The morning we were supposed to leave for golf, I told Jason I needed to make a quick stop before we headed out. He didn't think much of it, and we drove off together as planned. But instead of going straight to the golf course, I circled back toward the house. Jason looked confused, but I told him I had forgotten something and needed to go home. When we pulled up to the house, I saw Ethan's car, parked in the driveway. Jason looked at me, eyes wide, but I didn't say anything. I told him to wait in the car and got out, my heart pounding with adrenaline. I walked up to the front door, bracing myself for what I was about to find. As I opened the door, I heard their voices coming from upstairs, Emily and Ethan, laughing together. My blood boiled. I moved quietly, making my way up the stairs, each step heavier than the last. My worst fears were about to be confirmed, and there was no turning back. When I reached the bedroom door, I stood there for a moment, listening. They hadn't heard me. I could hear their voices, the sound of their laughter, and something inside me snapped. I swung the door open, and there they were, sitting far too close on the bed, clearly startled by my sudden appearance. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. The door slammed open with such force that it rattled on its hinges. Emily and Ethan both jumped, startled, their faces draining of color as they stared at me, frozen in place. I felt the blood rushing in my ears, my pulse hammering so loudly that it drowned out the awkward silence that followed. My eyes darted between the two of them, sitting far too close on the bed caught in the act, though they hadn't yet crossed a line right in front of me. But I knew better. I had seen and heard enough. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my voice shaking with a fury I had never felt before. Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. He looked terrified, completely out of his depth, as though he was only just realizing the magnitude of what they had done. Emily, on the other hand, found her voice quickly, though it came out weak, almost a whisper. "Wait, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, standing up from the bed and taking a hesitant step toward me, hands raised as if she could somehow calm the situation. But I was far beyond being calmed. Her words hit me like a brick, hollow and meaningless. I laughed bitterly. "Not what it looks like? Really? That's the best you can come up with?" I shook my head, feeling a rush of anger so intense it made my hands tremble. "Do you think I haven't seen the texts? The calls? I know what's been going on, Emily. I've known for weeks." Her eyes widened, and she glanced quickly at Ethan, whose face had turned a sickly shade of pale. It was clear that neither of them had expected this. They had been so careful, or so they thought. But they hadn't counted on me paying attention, hadn't counted on me putting the pieces together. Ethan finally spoke, his voice cracking as he tried to explain. "I swear, man, it's not what you think. We didn't. Nothing happen." "Shut up," I barked, my voice rising with fury. "Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I don't know what's been going on behind my back?" I took a step closer to him, and he shrank back on the bed, his hands up in defense. "You think because you're young and she's bored that it's okay to come into my house, sit in my home, and pretend you're part of this family while you sneak around behind my back?" Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the door as if he were planning to make a run for it. I could see the panic in his face, and for a split second, I felt an odd satisfaction at his fear. He wasn't the cool, confident guy he had pretended to be. Now, he was just a scared kid who had gotten in way over his head. Emily stepped between us, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." "It's not." I cut her off. "Explain what, Emily? That you've been lying to me? That you've been sneaking around with our son's best friend behind my back?" I could feel my voice rising, my anger boiling over. "I trusted you. I believed in you. And you threw it all away for this?" She flinched at my words, tears welling up in her eyes. But I wasn't interested in her tears. Not anymore. For weeks, I had felt like I was losing my mind, questioning everything, wondering if I was just being paranoid. But now, standing here in front of them, I knew I had been right all along. They had been playing me for a fool, and I was done pretending. Ethan scrambled to his feet, taking a step toward the door. "I should go," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm sorry." "You're not going anywhere," I snapped, stepping in front of the door. "You don't get to run away from this. You owe me an explanation." He looked like he was about to bolt, but I wasn't going to let him off that easy. I needed to hear it from him, hear him admit what they had done. I needed to hear the words, even if they ripped me apart inside. Emily's voice broke through the tense silence. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, it just happened? You expect me to believe that? What, you just accidentally ended up in this situation? You accidentally started lying to me, sneaking around, planning trips together?" Her face crumpled, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant to hurt you. You never meant to hurt me?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've been cheating on me with our son's best friend, and you never meant to hurt me?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door again, clearly desperate to leave. "I should go," he muttered again, edging toward the exit. "No," I said firmly, blocking his path. You're going to stand here and explain to me why you thought this was okay. Why you thought you could come into my home, sit at my dinner table, and betray me like this." He swallowed hard, his face pale. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It just got out of control." I stared at him, my mind racing. The anger I felt toward him was overwhelming, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that he was just a kid, a stupid, reckless kid who had made a terrible mistake. But that didn't excuse what he had done. "And you," I said, turning my attention back to Emily, "what about you? You've been lying to me for how long? Weeks? Months? How long has this been going on?" She wiped at her tears, her voice barely a whisper. "A few months. I didn't know how to stop it." I shook my head in disbelief. "You didn't know how to stop it? You could have stopped it by not starting it in the first place. You could have stopped it by being honest with me, by remembering that we're supposed to be partners, a family." I could feel my anger bubbling over again, and I had to take a deep breath to calm myself. "You've ruined everything, Emily. Everything we've built together, everything we had. And for what? For this?" I gestured to Ethan, who looked like he wanted to disappear. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stood there, tears streaming down her face, while Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glued to the floor. I felt the weight of it all crashing down on me, the lies, the betrayal, the loss of the life I thought we had. It was too much. I needed to get out of there, to breathe, to think. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving them standing there in the mess they had created. As I descended the stairs, I could hear Emily sobbing quietly behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and leaned against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Jason was still sitting in the car, waiting. I hadn't thought about what I was going to say to him. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell him that his best friend had betrayed him, that his mother had done the unthinkable? I took a deep breath and walked over to the car, forcing myself to stay calm. Jason looked up at me, his face full of confusion and concern. "Dad?" he asked, his voice tentative. "What's going on?" I opened the car door and sat down next to him, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I stared straight ahead, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. How was I supposed to explain this to my son? "We need to talk," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. As we drove away from the house, Jason stared at me, waiting for answers. I could feel his eyes burning into the side of my face, but I didn't look at him. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, the tension in my chest unbearable. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell him that his best friend had betrayed us in the worst way possible? "Dad?" Jason's voice broke through the thick silence, filled with confusion and concern. "What's going on? Why did we leave? Is something wrong with Mom?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I didn't know how to say it, how to break the news to him without shattering him. But he deserved the truth. He deserved to know what had been happening right under his nose. I pulled the car to the side of the road, parking in a quiet spot where we wouldn't be disturbed. Jason looked around, bewildered, as if trying to piece together the situation on his own. His brow furrowed, and he turned to me, his eyes searching mine for answers. "Jason, listen," I began, my voice rough from the emotions boiling inside me. "There's something you need to know. Something about your mom, and Ethan." His eyes widened in shock. "Ethan? What about him?" I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but there was no easy way to say it. No way to cushion the blow. "I caught them," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I caught them together. In our house. Just now." Jason blinked at me, not understanding at first. Then his face twisted with confusion. "What do you mean, together? Like, hanging out?" I shook my head slowly, feeling the weight of the truth crushing me. "No, Jason. Not like that. They've been involved. They've been seeing each other behind our backs." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, suffocating both of us. Jason's face went pale, his mouth opening in shock. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "No way. Ethan wouldn't do that. Mom wouldn't do that. You must be wrong. I'm not wrong, I said firmly, my voice filled with anger and pain. I saw it with my own eyes. I've been suspicious for weeks. The texts, the phone calls, the sneaking around. It's all true, Jason. Your best friend and your mother have been lying to us. For a moment, Jason just sat there, frozen in place as the truth sank in. His eyes filled with confusion, then with rage. You're lying, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. This can't be real. Ethan wouldn't do that to me. I wish I were lying, I said softly, feeling the raw pain in my son's voice. I wish none of this were true, but it is. Jason's hands clenched into fists as he struggled to process what I had just told him. I don't understand. Why would they? How could they? He cut himself off, his voice breaking. Mom? Ethan? I don't believe it. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, the refusal to accept the truth. And I understood. It was hard enough for me to accept, and I was the one who had seen it firsthand. But for Jason, the betrayal was even deeper. His best friend, his own mother. How could he make sense of that? I didn't want to believe it either, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. But the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. I didn't want to believe that she could do this to us. Jason stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. How long? He asked, his voice tight. How long has this been going on? I'm not sure, I admitted. A few months, maybe longer. I only started noticing things recently. Jason sat back in his seat, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths as he tried to contain his emotions. I can't believe this, he muttered under his breath. I trusted him. I trusted both of them. I reached out to put a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged me off, his face twisted with pain. Why didn't you stop it? He demanded, his voice rising. Why didn't you say something sooner? I didn't have proof until now, I explained. I didn't want to confront them without being sure. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I should have done something sooner. Jason's face turned red with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. They ruined everything, he spat. How could they do this to us? I had no answer for him. I had been asking myself the same question. How could Emily throw away everything we had built together for a fling with a younger guy? How could Ethan betray his best friend and me, a man who had treated him like family? After what felt like an eternity of silence, Jason finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. What are we going to do now? I didn't have a clear answer. I hadn't thought that far ahead. The anger, the betrayal, and the pain were too overwhelming to think beyond what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I do know one thing: this isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Jason's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy I had once known, the boy I had raised and protected. Now, he was faced with a pain I couldn't shield him from. I feel like everything's falling apart, he said softly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I nodded, feeling the same way. It feels that way right now, but we'll get through this. I promise you. Jason stared out the window, his jaw tight. I can't ever talk to Ethan again. He's dead to me. I didn't blame him. Ethan had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The betrayal ran too deep, and there was no coming back from it. Whatever friendship they had was over. As we sat there, trying to make sense of the chaos that had just erupted in our lives, I realized that this wasn't just about my marriage falling apart. It was about the trust that had been shattered, between Jason and his best friend, between me and Emily, between all of us. After a long silence, I turned to Jason. We'll figure this out together, I promised. Whatever happens next, we'll deal with it. One step at a time. Jason nodded, his face still filled with pain, but also with determination. I just don't know how to face Mom, he muttered. I don't know how I'll ever look at her the same way again. I felt the same way. Emily had not only betrayed me, she had destroyed the trust our family had. There was no fixing that. We'll deal with it when the time comes, I said, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. Right now, let's just focus on getting through today. Jason nodded, though I could see the anger still simmering in his eyes. He was broken, just like I was. And no matter what happened next, nothing would ever repair the damage Emily and Ethan had done to us. The drive back home was quiet, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. When we pulled up to the house, Ethan's car was gone. The house looked peaceful from the outside, as if nothing had happened, as if our lives hadn't just been torn apart. Jason turned to me. "I can't go in there," he said quietly. I nodded in understanding. "I'll talk to her. You don't have to deal with this right now." Jason got out of the car and walked down the street, needing space, needing to be away from the nightmare our lives had become. I watched him go, my heart heavy with grief for what had been lost. Taking a deep breath, I turned back toward the house. It was time for the confrontation I had been dreading. Time to face Emily. There was no going back now. The moment I stepped back into the house, the silence hit me. It was the kind of silence that filled a room after a storm, the stillness after chaos. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her face streaked with tears, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't look up when I entered, didn't say a word. It was as if she knew there was nothing left to say. I stood there for a moment, staring at her. This woman, the person I had trusted with my heart, my life, had shattered everything. The betrayal had dug deep into me, and every second I stood there made the pain worse. The anger I had felt when I caught them upstairs was still there, bubbling under the surface, but now it was mixed with something else, an overwhelming need for justice, for revenge. "Where's Ethan?" I asked, my voice cold, emotionless. Emily sniffed, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "He left," she whispered, her voice shaky. He's gone." "Good," I muttered, the bitterness lacing my words. "I don't ever want to see him again." Emily finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret and shame. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I never meant for this to happen. It just got out of control." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Out of control? You think this just happened?" "No, Emily. You made a choice. You chose to betray me, betray Jason, betray everything we built. Don't stand there and act like it was a mistake." She flinched at my words, her tears falling harder now. But I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy for her. Not after what she had done. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But I still love you. I don't want to lose you. Please, can we try to fix this?" Fix this? The audacity of her suggestion made my blood boil. How could she stand there and ask me to fix something she had broken so completely? The more she spoke, the more I realized that I wasn't just angry, I was furious. And the idea of fixing anything was laughable at this point. "There's no fixing this, Emily," I said, my voice low and cold. "You destroyed it. And you're right, you don't deserve forgiveness." She sobbed quietly, but I didn't care. I turned away, my mind already racing with what I would do next. Forgiveness wasn't on the table, but something else was. Revenge. I wasn't the kind of man who could just sit back and let this go. I needed to take control of the situation, to regain some sense of power after she had humiliated me. And I knew exactly how to do it. I left the house that night without saying another word. Emily called after me, but I didn't turn back. I needed air, space to clear my head, to figure out how I was going to handle the wreckage that was now my life. As I walked down the empty streets, my anger festered, but it also sharpened into something cold and calculated. I wasn't going to be the victim anymore. If Emily thought she could destroy our marriage and then beg for forgiveness, she was dead wrong. She wasn't the only one who could play this game. I had already made my decision. Her betrayal had freed me in a way, opened the door for something I hadn't considered before. If she could throw away our marriage for someone else, why couldn't I? It wasn't just about cheating for revenge. It was about proving to myself that I wasn't helpless, that I wasn't broken beyond repair. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A few weeks after the confrontation, I met someone, Rachel. She was a colleague I'd crossed paths with before, but I had never really paid her much attention. That changed. Rachel was smart, beautiful, and, most importantly, she made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Desire, control, power. Rachel didn't know about what had happened with Emily, and I didn't feel the need to tell her. She was a fresh start, someone who wasn't tainted by the mess my marriage had become. Our conversation started out innocent enough, work-related, casual, but I could feel the shift between us. The looks that lingered a little too long, the way her hand brushed mine when we were talking. There was an electricity between us that I hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a late work meeting, I invited her out for a drink. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I knew exactly what I was doing. We went to a small bar downtown, and as we sat there, sipping our drinks, the tension between us grew. I could see it in her eyes. She wanted this as much as I did. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the anger still simmering inside me, but I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Rachel," I said softly, "there's something I've been wanting to do for a while now." She looked at me, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What's that?" she asked, her voice low, almost breathless. Without thinking, without second-guessing myself, I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was filled with months of pent-up anger, frustration, and the need to feel in control again. Rachel responded immediately, her hands moving to my neck, pulling me closer. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about Emily, or Jason, or even the fallout from what I was doing. All I cared about was reclaiming my life, my pride. If Emily could betray me, then I had every right to do the same. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed with Rachel, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to happiness, or at least satisfaction. It wasn't love, it wasn't even about Rachel, really. It was about taking back what Emily had taken from me. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. What I had done didn't fix anything, but it didn't make me feel guilty either. It felt like balance. Emily had betrayed me, and now I had done the same. The playing field was even. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face pale and anxious. She knew I had been out all night, and the guilt was written all over her face. I could tell she wanted to ask me where I had been, but she didn't have the courage. Instead, she just watched me, her eyes filled with regret. I walked past her without a word, heading upstairs to shower. I didn't owe her an explanation. Not anymore. The part of me that had once cared about her feelings, about making things right, was gone. What we had was over, and I had already moved on mentally and now, physically. Later that evening, she finally worked up the nerve to ask me, "Where were you last night?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. I looked at her, my expression cold. "I was where I wanted to be," I said flatly, not offering anything more. Her face fell, and I saw the realization wash over her. She knew. She knew what I had done, and there was nothing she could say to undo it. I had taken my revenge, and now we were both living with the consequences of our choices. We didn't talk much after that. The atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension, but I didn't care. I had already checked out. The marriage was dead, and we both knew it. I had never been one for petty revenge, but in this case, it felt justified. Emily had made her choice, and so had I. We were both guilty, both broken in different ways. But at least now, I had the satisfaction of knowing that I wasn't the only one who had been hurt. I had taken back my power, and in a strange way, that gave me peace. The days after my confrontation with Emily and my revenge felt surreal, as if I was living someone else's life. I went through the motions, getting up, going to work, coming home, but it felt like the pieces of my old life had shattered beyond recognition. The house felt cold, lifeless, even when Emily and Jason were there. The air was thick with silence, and the distance between us was palpable. Emily didn't ask any more questions after that night. She knew I had cheated, just as she had, and the weight of it hung between us like a toxic cloud. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was only out of necessity. The marriage, once a living, breathing thing, was now nothing more than a hollow shell. Jason, meanwhile, had distanced himself from both of us. He was hurt, betrayed not only by his mother but by his best friend, Ethan. I could see the pain in his eyes every time he looked at her, and I knew that things between them would never be the same. He hadn't spoken to Ethan since the day I told him the truth, and I doubted he ever would. One evening, a few weeks after everything had come crashing down, Jason came to me. He stood in the doorway of my office, looking lost and broken. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know how to move on." I looked up from my desk, feeling the weight of his words. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that we couldn't keep living like this in a house filled with anger, regret, and silence. We had to move forward, somehow. "I know, Jason," I said, my voice softer than usual, "but we'll figure it out together. We'll find a way." He nodded, his face still clouded with pain. I don't think I can stay here anymore. Not with Mom. Not with everything that's happened." I understood what he meant. The house, once a place of comfort and security, had become a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. It was filled with memories that had now been tainted by betrayal. "Then maybe it's time for a change," I said, surprising myself with the words. I hadn't thought much about what the future held, but as I said it, I realized it was true. We couldn't stay here, not like this. Jason looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's time for us to start fresh," I explained. "This house, it doesn't feel like home anymore, does it?" Jason shook his head slowly, his eyes downcast. "No, it doesn't." I took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling in. "Then let's leave. We don't need to stay here. We can move somewhere new, somewhere that isn't filled with all of this mess." Jason stared at me, processing what I was saying. "But what about Mom?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Your mom and we're done, Jason. There's no fixing this. I don't think either of us wants to try anymore." He didn't say anything for a long moment, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He loved his mother, despite what she had done, and leaving her behind would be hard. But he was right staying here. Living under the same roof with the woman who had betrayed both of us was unbearable. "I'll talk to her," I said finally. "We'll figure out the details, but I think it's best if you and I move on. We'll find a place of our own. It's time for a new beginning." Jason nodded slowly, his expression filled with uncertainty but also a glimmer of hope. "Okay," he said softly. "Maybe that's what we need." That night, I approached Emily for the last time. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, lost in her own thoughts. She looked up when I entered, her face tired and drawn, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down across from her. She nodded, her eyes dull with resignation. "I know. I think it's time we end this," I said, my voice steady but firm. "There's nothing left between us, Emily. We both know that." She didn't argue. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she just nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I've ruined everything." There was a time when her tears would have broken me, when I would have done anything to comfort her, to fix things. But that time had passed. I had nothing left to give her. "It's over," I said, my voice cold but not unkind. "Jason and I are leaving. We'll find a new place. You can stay here, or you can go. It's up to you." She blinked at me, the tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never wanted it to end like this," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "Neither did I said quietly. "But we both made our choices, and now we have to live with them." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the finality settling over us. This was the end. There would be no reconciliation, no last-minute attempts to save what had already been destroyed. A week later, Jason and I packed our things and left the house behind. It was strange, walking out the door for the last time, leaving behind the place where we had once been a family. But it also felt like a relief, a weight lifted off my shoulders. The house no longer felt like home, and I was ready to leave it all behind. We found a new place not far from the old house, a smaller, quieter home that felt like a blank slate. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Jason and I spent the first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, and slowly adjusting to our new reality. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the weight of what had happened hit me like a punch to the gut. But there was also a sense of freedom, of possibility. Emily didn't fight me on the divorce. It was quick, clean, and unemotional, just as I had expected. She stayed in the old house, and we went our separate ways. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation. We were both too tired for that. Jason and I slowly started to rebuild our lives. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the anger and hurt would resurface, when the memory of what had happened would threaten to pull me under. But with each passing day, it got a little easier. The pain became more distant, less immediate. I had stopped asking why and had started focusing on what's next. Rachel and I stayed in touch, though things between us had cooled off after that one night. I hadn't pursued anything further with her, and she hadn't pushed for more. It had been what it needed to be, a brief escape, a moment of revenge. But now, I was ready to move forward without anger driving me. In the months that followed, Jason and I found a new rhythm, a new normal. We weren't the same people we had been before all of this, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. We had both been broken by what had happened, but we were slowly putting ourselves back together. It was a new beginning, not just for me, but for Jason as well. The scars of betrayal would always be there, but we had learned to live with them. And in time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was life after betrayal. We weren't defined by what had happened to us. We were defined by how we moved forward.